Good morning, everyone. As you are aware, this year the GWII celebrates its 10-year anniversary. In line with this milestone, so many of you have heeded the call put forth by our GWII President, Catherine Albertine, to make this the year of yes. And to this end, many of you have participated in our monthly activities, and the month of June is no exception. With this being the month of environmental sustainability, proudly brought to you by Charter Risk Underwriting Managers. So, to kick off the month, we are thrilled to bring you a very special CPD accredited webinar. The GWII prides itself on providing networking opportunities as well as personal educational development. Our continuous development program is an initiative we feel very strongly about, and I'm proud to host this morning's event. My name is Valine Peters. I'm a proud committee member of the GWII. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. This month, we are asking you to say yes to being environmentally conscious and to making sustainable choices. For all the behind-the-scenes hard work which goes into making our GWII events a success, I would like to extend my gratitude to the GWII President, Catherine Albertine, Vice President Kimber Roberts, GWII committee members, the GWII office, and a special word of thanks to Michelle Schroeder-Rankin, who always so willingly assists. Thank you to our broadcast partners, CN & Co., and a word of thanks to our accreditation partners, the IISA, who recognize the importance of ESG topics such as these. A few housekeeping rules before we begin. Please could you mute your mics and turn off your videos, as the session will be recorded. This is an interactive session. We not only welcome any questions, we really do encourage you to ask them. So just pop your questions in the Q&A box. We will be monitoring them and we will endeavor to answer them at the end of the session. This is, of course, a CPD accredited event. For you to earn your one-phase CPD hour, you will need to remain logged in for the duration of the event. Environmental sustainability is a topic I am really passionate about, and I believe that we can all play our part in the long-term health of our planet. Our speaker today is Professor Melanie Samson. She has freely and graciously given of her time to provide some insight into what many of us spend so very little time, if any, considering. She is an associate professor in sociology at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. For the past decade, Melanie's research has arisen out of and contributed to her political work, accompanying waste picker movements in South Africa and globally. Her academic work focuses on the political ecology of reclaiming, the production of value by non-wage workers, and reclaimer struggles to transform the economy, polity, and society. Melanie facilitated the multi-party participatory process to develop the South African government's Waste Picker Integration Guide and is the primary author of the guideline. She led stakeholder participation in the development of South Africa Waste Picker Registration System and the piloting and initial rollout of the South Africa Waste Picker Registration System. The multimedia materials on waste picker integration that she and her team developed for the Reclaim, Revalue, Reframe project, funded by the governments of Japan and UNIDO, can be found on wastepickerintegration.org website. With that, I'd like to hand over to you, Professor.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's a real pleasure to be here. My talk is titled Hidden in Plain Sight, and I'll be focusing on the environmental role of reclaimers, who are also called waste pickers, although it's a term that they prefer not to have used, which I'll explain a little bit about that. And what I want to do at the end of my presentation is focus on what you can do to support reclaimers in the environmental role that they are playing and to help make a change in the urban and social environment. So I will just share my presentation now. Helene, can you see my presentation?
Yes, perfectly, Professor.
Fantastic. All right. So I think that if I asked you, if we were all in the same room and I asked you if you have seen a reclaimer, all of you would say yes. If I asked you how many of you have spoken with a reclaimer or know the name of the reclaimer who collects recyclables from your rubbish bin every week, unfortunately, many of you would say no, and this is why I say that reclaimers are hidden in plain sight. Now, the first question that I want to start by looking at is, how is it possible to be hidden in plain sight? How is it possible that people are coming to our homes every single week, and yet somehow we don't see them and we don't know them? So what I argue is that reclaimers, as I mentioned, people often refer to them as waste pickers. And what reclaimers in Johannesburg and around the world will say to you is, we're not waste pickers. We're not interested in waste. And we don't just pick things. The work that we do involves a lot of labor. It involves a lot of knowledge. We are interested in value, not waste. The only reason why we have to go through rubbish bins, and residents often complain, middle-class residents will say, oh, reclaimers, they make a mess. They come on garbage day and they strew the garbage all over the street. Well, as reclaimers, very rightly point out, the only reason they have to go through our garbage bins is because we, as middle-class and wealthy residents, are so filthy and unthinking and ignorant that we take items that we know have value, that can be recycled, that we know that other human beings want to support their families, but instead of separating them nicely to give to reclaimers, we bury our recyclables in our trash. And so I think they are then forced to salvage from those bins. And I'm going to come back at the end of my talk to talk about what you can do to change that. But I just want to really reinforce the point that these are reclaimers who are reclaiming things of value, and they must engage with waste because we are the ones who hide our recyclables there. Nevertheless, we refer to them as waste pickers and we associate them with waste. And there is a long history within the context of colonialism and racial capitalism of dehumanizing African people. If you want to come from Europe and conquer a foreign nation, a foreign land, and enslave people, steal their land, force them to work for you. It's very difficult to do that if you see them as equals, if you see them as human beings. And so we know from the colonial archives, there's a very long history of dehumanizing African and indigenous people in the Americas and in Asia. And associating African and indigenous people with waste, with disease, with animals, so that Europeans could justify the enslavement and gross exploitation of their labor. And associating African people with waste became a key part of this process of dehumanization and rendering them disposable. And there's a really brilliant South African political economist, unfortunately, who passed away a number of years ago, named Bernard Magubane. And Magubane made the really important point of saying, African people in the history of colonialism, apartheid, and racial capitalism were not disposable in the sense of being dispensable, we can throw them away. His argument was we framed people as disposable because they were essential. We required their labor to develop the gold mines, to develop the diamond mines, to be the foundation of industry. But we also colonizers did not want to pay them fairly for the labor that they performed and treated them as if they were dispensable. So I argue that this metaphor of disposability is crucially important. And what it meant is that colonizers treated African people as if they were disposable so that we could place them and their resources at our disposal as colonizers, as capitalists, to exploit their labor and seize their land. And what has happened is that even though we are now in a post-apartheid context, and legally we have done away with our racist laws, of course, there are still so many discriminatory biases and stereotypes which continue to associate African people with waste and with disease and to dehumanize them. But in particular, people who work with waste in South Africa, Africa, and around the world are treated as if they are somehow diseased, as if they are somehow unworthy, as if they are not human. And in fact, we often talk, or colleagues in academia sometimes will talk about reclaimers and other poor people working in the informal economy as so-called human waste or as disposable people. And a lot of my academic work really counters this, because as soon as we begin to dehumanize someone, that is the route to exploitation. And so I'm belaboring this point because I really hope that if you take one thing away from my presentation, you will stop referring to people who do this crucially important labor as waste pickers and refer to them as they prefer to be called in English, which is as reclaimers of value, and to understand that the discriminatory attitudes that many of us continue to have towards reclaimers have a profound history in colonialism, racial capitalism, and white supremacy. And so if we say that we want to deracialize the economy, deracialize society, if we want to have a true democracy, and we certainly know this week how important creating a truly democratic country is, we have to take responsibility for transforming the social relations, the very intimate social relations that arise out of what we do as residents with our waste and recyclables. So reclaimers, again, when I go on the radio, when reclaimers go on the radio, things are shifting now. Now I get a lot more people calling in and being much more positive, understanding the contributions reclaimers make, but very often we'll still get people from bourgeois, wealthy suburbs saying, oh, they're such nuisances, they make a mess. But my question here is, should we see reclaimers as nuisances or as necessary? And I think one of the key points that I like to drive home is when we look at reclaimers, we often focus on them as, random individuals who we think may have mental health issues, who are eking out a living and extracting recyclables from our garbage bins. We think of them as individuals. And yet, as you can see from the diagram that I'm showing you, reclaimers have created what I call a separation outside source system. I'm sure you've all heard of separation at source. That's when the government says to residents, we want you to separate your recyclables. But because in South Africa, government never put those programs in place, they're only trying to start now. It's reclaimers, these very entrepreneurial men and women who recognized a gap in the market, that residents were throwing away items of value, and they began to extract the recyclables from the waste stream. What's crucial here is it is a system. And I'm going to come back and talk about the importance of understanding that, poor people have created an infrastructure that was not in place. They have created a municipal service where none existed. It's called the separation outside source system. So how significant is the work they do? Well, it is really quite remarkable. What the statistics show is that South Africa has recycling rates for some plastics that are comparable to European countries, even though we have not had official municipal recycling programs that European countries have had. It is solely because of the labor that reclaimers have been providing. My colleague, Professor Linda Godfrey from the CSIR, and her colleagues in 2016 published what's now a very famous paper where they looked at data that came from the recycling industry itself that found that 70 to 80% of the post-consumer packaging and paper, that's the packaging and paper that's been used and thrown away, 70 to 80, actually 80 to 90% of the post-consumer packaging and paper that entered the recycling stream in South Africa in 2015 had been salvaged by reclaimers. Simply put, we would not have a recycling industry without the labor of reclaimers. They are environmental heroes. They are the foundation of our recycling economy. In the same paper, GWII and her colleagues found that at that time, remember this is 2015, this is a long time ago now, they were saving municipalities up to 748 million rand a year in landfill airspace. That's just the savings in landfill airspace. And I'm sure if you live in Johannesburg, you have heard municipal officials talking about the fact that all of our rubbish dumps will be full in 3 years. In Cape Town, the landfills are already almost at capacity, and we all know how expensive land is in Cape Town. The city of Cape Town is struggling to find where are they going to build new landfills. Well, if it hadn't been for reclaimers, these landfills would have been full decades ago. They are saving us and our municipalities a huge amount of money. And in addition to this 748 million rand a year in landfill airspace, because of reclaimers, the municipalities pick it up, need to send out fewer trucks. That means they send out fewer workers. It also means savings on diesel, and it reduces the greenhouse gas emissions of our municipalities. So I hope that this one slide is making absolutely clear to you the crucial environmental contributions made by these people who unfortunately are often still referred to as scavengers, as nuisances, as problems. So, something that's very interesting is when people do talk about supporting reclaimers, they see them as poor marginal people. Let's give them some charity. The reality is that reclaimers have been subsidizing municipalities and industry for decades. And so there is a historical debt. There are reparations owed to reclaimers. When I began working with reclaimers in 2008, 2009, there was overwhelming hostility towards them, and our national legislation did not acknowledge the role that they play. This is beginning to change. Between 2016 and 2019, I was very privileged to facilitate a multi-party participatory evidence-based policy-making process for national government. So what that means is that I convened on behalf of the National Department of Environmental Affairs, which is now called the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and Environment. I convened a national working group that had representatives from reclaimer organizations, from the recycling industry, municipalities, national government, SALGA, and NGOs. And we sat together to write what is called the Waste Picker Integration Guideline for South Africa. I've included a link here where you can access it if you want. The Waste Picker Integration Guideline was really crucially important in terms of developing recycling policy for the country, but also the Department of Science and Innovation, which also funded this process, was very excited by the participatory process that we used and feels that it would be ideal if we could use a similar process in other sectors. Because what we did when we wrote the guideline is we said, okay, Professor Samson, Professor GWII may have PhDs on this topic. There may be industry experts who earn millions of rands a year. There may be municipal officials who've been working on this issue for a very long time. But our starting point for developing our guideline was to say that the real experts on how to extract recyclables from the waste stream in South Africa are reclaimers, because they are the only ones who've been doing it for so many decades. And we know that when municipalities in South Africa and around the world contract for-profit private companies to extract recyclables from the waste stream, inevitably, they always have lower recycling rates than reclaimers, because it's reclaimers who have the deep knowledge of how to recycle in these post-colonial contexts. And so our starting point for writing the guideline was we need to listen to the real experts who are the reclaimers. And we came with a definition of waste picker integration for South Africa, which is very radical and exciting and is now considered global best practice. So when we talk about waste picker integration, which is kind of the global policy terminology, Usually people think that means getting professors, getting municipal officials and consultants together to develop recycling programs and then finding ways to include individual waste pickers. But once we acknowledge that reclaimers have created the recycling system in the country and that they are the experts, we flipped that on its head. So our definition of waste picker integration in South Africa is as follows. It is the creation of a formally planned recycling system. And of course, formally planned doesn't mean by municipal officials. It means by the key stakeholders with waste pickers taking the lead. It is the creation of a formally planned recycling system that values and improves the present role of waste pickers, builds on the strength of their existing system for collecting and revaluing materials, includes waste pickers as key partners in its design, implementation, evaluation, revision, and includes the integration of waste pickers' work, as well as the political, economic, social, legal, and environmental integration of waste pickers. That last bullet point is really, really important because due to this colonial, racial, capitalist, apartheid history, right, which marginalizes, stigmatizes, criminalizes, and excludes reclaimers and other people who do similar kinds of work, we don't just need to integrate their work. There needs to be political integration. We need to recognize them as key members of our polity, of our society. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we do this. So in the guideline, many people had said to us when we were writing the guideline, the municipalities and industry were saying, we want you to give us a model. Tell us, what program do we put in place for waste picker integration? But, not only is Johannesburg very different from Case Kamahuk, from a rural area. Johannesburg is very different from Cape Town, and Sandton is very different from Norwood, is very different from Alex. So we said we cannot give you one model for how to recycle or how to integrate waste pickers, but we can give you a set of principles that should underpin all of the work that you do on recycling and with reclaimers. And I'm not going to read through all of the detail. I'm just going to give you the headlines because they're really important. And I think that these principles can guide the work we do with every constituency and within every sector of the economy and the environment, not just reclaimers. The first is recognition, respect, and redress. We have to start by recognizing the role reclaimers play in the economy and for the environment, and we have to respect them and we have to provide them with redress. Secondly, we need to value their expertise. Third, we need meaningful engagement. Leanda GWII, who's a really brilliant reclaimer leader in the African Reclaimers Organization, always says to government, we're sick and tired, and industry, we're sick and tired of your unmeaningful engagement. You come with your plans and then you invite us to a meeting. And that's not the way this is supposed to work. And I think it's not just reclaimers who are treated that way. I think as residents and citizens, this is the typical way that we're treated by government. And what we've said with reclaimer integration or waste picker integration is meaningful integration means including them as equal partners in all decision making. Imagine how different our country would be if this is how we treated residents in solving the electricity problems, in our water problems, etc. We said we need to build on what exists. This is really important because often in South Africa and other post-colonial countries, we think that best practice means importing a model from Europe. But, in Europe, they do not have 50% unemployment rates as we do in South Africa. They also do not have, when they began doing recycling, putting in place municipal recycling programs, they did not have a vibrant separation outside source system that already existed. And so when we import models from elsewhere, it creates chaos rather than improving the situation we have. So we've said we need to start by building on what exists in our country. Obviously, if we're going to have waste picker integration, it needs to increase diversion and it must be cost effective. It must be evidence-based. Now, this was really important because many municipalities just assume that it's going to be more effective and efficient to contract a for-profit private company. So they don't even bother doing the research. Whereas all of the research globally and in South Africa shows that it is more effective and cost efficient to do recycling with reclaimers rather than with for-profit private companies. When we did a study in Johannesburg, and extrapolated from our data, we found that if all of the reclaimers in Johannesburg collected as many recyclables as the ones in our study, it would take them an average of 27.7 days to collect as many recyclables as Pick It Up and all of the private companies and cooperatives Pick It Up contracted to collect in 1 year. So in less than a month, reclaimers are collecting more than the city and all of its subcontractors. So we need to move away from the ideological assumptions that say the formal economy and formal companies are better than the informal and that private companies are better than reclaimers. We need to make our policies based on evidence. We need to create an enabling environment, which means changing bylaws and national legislation that discriminate against and criminalize reclaimers and rather facilitate their work. Waste picker integration must improve the conditions and income of reclaimers. Something that I found very fascinating is that when we analyzed the projects that municipalities had been putting in place for reclaimers, very often their working conditions became worse and their incomes became worse. Why? Because those programs were designed by municipal officials and consultants who did not understand how the existing separation outside source system worked. So they spent huge amounts of money on programs that reclaimers did not want to participate in because they made them worse off, and they quit. It's only rational. But of course, if we want to say we are doing waste picker integration, we need to ensure that we are improving the conditions and income of these environmental heroes. We also said that reclaimers need to be paid for the service they provide. What is very fascinating is that in the city of Johannesburg, this program has ended now because of Pick It Up's bankruptcy or for being on the verge of bankruptcy, not because they recognized the program was wrong. But for many years, Pick It Up was paying for-profit private companies between 20 and 24 Rand a household per month in some areas of the city to collect separated recyclables. They paid those companies whether the residents separated the materials, and we know the vast majority did not. They paid those companies whether a reclaimer got there first and took the materials. And so the municipality was spending tens, possibly hundreds of millions of rands on this program, but getting very few recyclables in place. However, when reclaimers provide the same service, they have been doing it for free. So, we often talk about the fact that during colonialism and continuing to the present because we're characterized by something called racial capitalism, our economy is predicated on the gross exploitation of underpaid Black labor. But the reality is with reclaimers, the recycling industry in South Africa is based on the gross exploitation of free labor by reclaimers. And we said this has to change. It cannot be that if a private company provides a service, we pay them. But if poor entrepreneurial people provide the service, they must do it for free. Finally, we need holistic integration. I've already spoken to that. So in our national guideline, we provide steps that municipalities can follow to have a participatory process to develop waste picker integration programs. So I want to speak because I imagine some of you live in suburbs where the city of Johannesburg or the city of Cape Town has tried to implement separation at source by private companies. And from this diagram, what you can see is the problem we've encountered in South Africa. If you remember, I showed you a similar picture earlier where we had a nice circle and the reclaimers in green were on the circle in their separation outside source system. But when the municipalities contract private companies, it is not as if we're in Europe and there was no recycling system in place. What they do is they displace, or in academic or political language, they dispossess the reclaimers. They push them to the margins. And they are collecting the same materials that the reclaimers have always depended on for their livelihoods. What is the result of this? Well, the reclaimers have fewer materials to collect because the companies are taking those same materials. And remember, their families have been depending on them. This is how they send their children to school. This is how they feed themselves and their families. For the private, so they either completely lose access to materials or it reduces dramatically. We also see an increase in criminalization, stigmatization, and harassment of reclaimers by security guards and by citizens, because there's some citizens who will say, no, pick it up, said I must give my recyclables to Pambili Waste. And so they would begin to verbally and physically attack the reclaimers to prevent them from getting the materials. Fortunately, our research shows there's other residents who would stand in solidarity with the reclaimers and say, wait a sec, I actually know Tundi, and she's been collecting my recyclables for many years, and I'm going to keep giving my materials to Tundi, not to the private company. So the negative impact is not just for the reclaimers, it's for the private companies, because when they bid for those tenders, they made an assumption that they would collect a certain tonnage of recyclables that they would sell. And they don't get that material because reclaimers have, of necessity, had to come and try to get the material before the companies. So the companies make less than they expected. And that's actually one of the reasons why some of the companies themselves pulled out of these programs. But in addition, the municipality, as I mentioned, is paying the private company to collect materials, even though the reclaimers are often taking them first. Middle class and wealthy residents, again, will often ask me or, call into radio stations and say, oh, there's reclaimers sleeping in the parks, why are they there? They're vagrants. The reality is all of the reclaimers, or virtually all reclaimers, have homes elsewhere. But they end up having to sleep in parks in middle class and wealthy suburbs to be closer to your homes so that they can beat the trucks from the private companies to get the recyclables. So one of the arguments that we've been making to the city is, if you want to address these problems and stop reclaimers from sleeping in parks, A, stop contracting the private companies. B, give the reclaimers secure access to the recyclables. C, work with residents to explain to them that the reclaimers are providing a service and you need to support them by separating the recyclables. And D, provide reclaimers with sorting spaces so that they don't have to use the parks to sort them and store the materials. And provide reclaimers with transport to get to the middle class and wealthy areas. And here I really want to make a very important point that, again, I'm borrowing from Luyanda GWII, from the African Reclaimers Organization. The recycling industry is very proud of its recycling rates, of how much of the post-consumer packaging and paper it manages to get out of the environment and into the recycling value chain. But there is no recycling company that is going to take, your Coke bottle. If you have your Coke bottle and it's empty, you cannot go to a recycling company and sell it to them. It needs to be cleaned. It needs to be sorted into proper categories. It needs to be baled, right? All of that takes time, and there needs to be space where that happens. So reclaimers are not the ones who are creating a problem by sorting recyclables in public spaces. Reclaimers are creating a solution to a problem, which is that neither the industry that wants those recyclables nor the municipalities that wants to make sure they don't go into the landfills have provided proper sorting spaces where the recyclables that have been taken out of the garbage can be cleaned and sorted so that they can be then sold by industry. So I really hope that you understand the point that I'm making. We blame them for creating a problem, when in reality, it is industry and government that's created the problem by not creating spaces, legal spaces, to sort recyclables and store them before they can be sold. Reclaimers have created the solution. Okay, so that is another one of the key takeaways that I hope you will take away from this input. So what is the solution? The solution is so simple. It's to say we already have a very effective separation, outside source system created by entrepreneurial people who have created a way to extract recyclables from the waste stream, instead of contracting private companies. As I've already said, let us officially recognize the role that reclaimers play and let us facilitate that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about at the end of my talk, about a very exciting project of the African Reclaimers Organization called Recycling with Reclaimers that we piloted in Johannesburg and has spread now across the city, and is something that you can do as a resident to make your contribution to improving recycling and improving the lives of reclaimers and in creating a more just economy. So that's just some background, and all of that, the points that I've made, you can read about in the National Guideline on Waste Picker Integration and my website, which I'll share at the end. Just to let you know that since we published the guideline in 2020, South Africa has something called a National Waste Management Strategy. I think the prior one was in 2011. It was updated in 2020. And fortunately, because of the work we did on the Waste Picker Integration Guideline, the 2020 National Waste Management Strategy recognizes the guideline. It says that by 2021, all metros should have integration programs, and by 2024, all secondary cities should have integration programs in place. Unfortunately, virtually no progress has been made on this, and national government has not been holding the municipalities to account. One of the things I've recently met with senior national government officials, and one of the recommendations that I've made to them is we need to reestablish our working group on waste picker integration, but make it like a standing committee. And we need to create and resource a municipal waste picker integration support program, because on the one hand, while I am very frustrated, particularly with the metros, because they do have the resources with the municipalities for not making progress on waste picker integration, at the same time, I do understand it's what we call kind of an unfunded mandate, that they are now required to do waste picker integration, but national government did not create an additional pot of money for them to access to support waste picker integration. And in addition, waste management departments are traditionally staffed by engineers with experience in managing waste, not with people who have, sociologists, social workers, political economists, who understand the issues related to recycling and who have the skills to facilitate these deep, meaningful engagements with reclaimers. So I'm proposing, and waste picker organizations are also proposing, that we need to create a support program. All right, and for me, one of the most exciting legislative advancements is, you may have heard the term EPR, or extended producer responsibility. And what extended producer responsibility means is that if a company produces an appliance, if it produces a vehicle, if it produces packaging, it needs to internalize the costs of the waste associated with their products. So the company is responsible for that product to the end of its life. Because, interestingly enough, one of the reasons why we have municipal recycling programs, they didn't start because of some grand environmental vision. In the 1980s in the United States, there was a very strong environmental movement, 1970s, 1980s, and they were pushing for radical transformations in industrial production, which still really need to happen if we're going to get out of the environmental crisis we're in, and particularly the plastics crisis. The response from industry, instead of saying, oh yes, we will stop producing so much waste, we will make our production more efficient, we will be more environmentally sensitive, the response was, oh, we can just recycle, right? But the key thing is, they then supported municipalities, but made municipalities responsible for recycling. And the reality is, these corporations are making profits by externalizing the costs of their waste. So EPR is, in theory, is meant to help to address this. So EPR says all of the corporations, the companies that are producing waste materials need to pay a new additional kind of tax. It's an EPR levy to help deal with their waste issues. And our EPR regulations, because of the guideline and the work that we had done, I think they may be the first EPR regulations in the world that say waste pickers or reclaimers must be paid from the environmental EPR levy. So our EPR regulations say that industry with part of the EPR levies must support waste picker integration and crucially must pay reclaimers for the service they provide. Because if you remember, I said at the beginning of my talk, when private companies are contracted by municipalities to collect recyclables, they're paid. But when reclaimers, who are poor Black people, do it, we've been expecting them to do it for free. So the very exciting thing about our EPR regulations is they say we need to pay the reclaimers. Now, how do we do this? I mentioned again earlier this project called Recycling with Reclaimers, piloted by the African Reclaimers Organization. They partnered with Unilever and with myself when I was at Wits University. And what we did is we worked in 2 residential areas of Johannesburg, Brixton and Auckland Park. And we worked with the resident associations and we said, reclaimers are going to now be your official service providers. The reclaimers, what's very exciting is the reclaimers themselves did education with the residents on how to separate recyclables, and they ran workshops with the resident association in the high schools with children in the local creche Mimosa, and go to all of the social events of the community to do education, to build relationships. And then the residents separate the materials for the reclaimers. And what we found is, if Pick It Up tells you separate the materials for us, many people are too lazy, and they say, why should I do this work for free for Pick It Up? Pick It Up is a company, it makes money. I have beautiful quotes from residents around this. But when Lunga is the reclaimer who collects from my house, and Lunga takes the time to introduce themselves to me, to tell them about me. And I, because I'm committed through my resident association to working with reclaimers, I make the time to talk to Lunga, and I get to know Lunga has 2 kids that they put through college, through university, with the money that they make from reclaiming, and now they're supporting their grandchildren. I am much more likely to separate my materials. Okay, so this is a wonderful model. But the other exciting thing about the pilot we did is Unilever said, okay, for every kilogram of recyclables that the reclaimer collects, we'll weigh that and we will pay them 50 cents as their service fee, which they got paid on top of the money they made when they sold their materials. And because we did this pilot, when we were negotiating the national EPR regulations, we were able to say, we have a model that works. And so this is the model that we are supposed to be implementing in South Africa right now. Again, we are a world leader. Every country in the world is looking to us as a model. The very unfortunate thing is that industry, these producer responsibility organizations, are in gross violation of the law. They are not doing what they need to do to be paying the reclaimers. And we are about to have a crisis related to this because reclaimers were told that they would be paid. So we urgently need industry to implement the legislation, the regulations, and we urgently need national government to take strict action against these companies and impose significant fines so that they wake up and start doing the right thing in terms of the regulations, but also in terms of really honoring the environmental heroes. The last thing that I want to say before I conclude is one of the wonderful things for me about working with reclaimers and doing the work that I do is we live in times which are very discouraging. We have a global climate crisis, we have a plastic crisis, we can see the crazy weather that we're having, and it is very hard to know, what can I do as an individual And recycling is not the answer, but it is a step, and it is something that each and every person can do. So what I would really encourage you, when you go home after work today, I really hope you'll sit down with your housemates, with your family, to explain to them the crucial role that reclaimers are playing, why we need to value and recognize and pay them, and what can you do differently. And some of you, I am sure, are already doing some of these things. But here's a simple list. Get to know the reclaimers who collect from your home and from your workplace. Greet them. Tell them how much you appreciate the work they are doing for you, for the environment, for the economy, and engage them as people in your community. If you are active in your resident association, or even if you aren't, maybe it's time to become active. Invite reclaimers and representatives of reclaimer organizations to come to your association meetings and tell you what materials are they looking for. What should you, because not everyone collects everything, because you only collect what you can sell in the area where you live, right? Or in the area where you work. So ask them what you can do to support them. Separate those materials for them. Have a separate bag. Put it beside your bin or on top of your bin so that they don't have to go through your rubbish. Talk to your neighbors and your resident association about creating a recycling with reclaimers program in your area. And it's such a simple thing to do. If you live in an apartment building, you can start there, a gated community, or any kind of residential area. Find out who the company you work for gives your recyclables to and when that contract is ending, and see if it's possible to give those materials to reclaimers instead of to a for-profit private company. And of course, reduce the amount of packaged goods that you buy. These are just some simple suggestions of things that anybody can do. If you go to my website, the website that my colleagues and I created for a project we did on waste picker integration. It's very easy. The URL is wastepickerintegration.org. And you can find information on everything that I've discussed. I think what's really nice is if you go to the visual resources, you'll find some animated cartoons we did for children. If you have children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews, show them those videos. They'll really enjoy them. But please, do what you can to support reclaimers. They're hidden in plain sight. They're there. They don't need to be hidden anymore. Play your role. Go out, meet them, engage them, and let's all work together to help to improve the environment, economy, and society that we live in. And I will end there so that we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor. Really appreciate that. That was so informative. And I think even for myself, just learning about how this waste, or sorry, reclaimer industry really works. I think it's been unbelievably informative. And I thank you so much for taking the time to really educate us on this. I think that it's so important that we have these conversations, because I think that very often they're conversations that never even occur to us to have. So I think it's really important. I think that, we had one question so far, Professor, from Ella Bella, who happens to be from an organization called Generation Earth, and Miss Earth, who's partnering with us this month. And so it's also very exciting to see some of our partners for the rest of this month hopping onto this as well. Ella has asked, Professor, let me just find her question, sorry. She's just asked, what can we as individuals do in our private capacity, and I suppose as practical tips to help reclaimers in their lives? So I think you have touched on this, sort of setting waste aside, etc. Is there anything else that you can say that we as individuals can do in our homes?
Sure. No, thank you so much for the question. And I'm seeing all of the responses. So thank you so much. So yes, I think, as I said, it's separating your materials, but the key starting point is talking to the reclaimers who work in your area, right? Because it makes such a difference for them in their daily working lives to be acknowledged, to be recognized, to be treated humanly. But also to talk to them to find out which materials they collect. Because as I say, reclaimers are entrepreneurs, and they are not going to take a material that they cannot sell that's worth their while, right? Because many of them, will walk 60 kilometers a day. They'll walk 30 kilometers to your neighborhood. Then they'll walk, and then they have to drag, 200 kgs on their trolleys back home. So find out what it is they're looking for, and the stuff they're not looking for, find another place to take that. Meet with your resident associations, create programs to engage them. But as I say, a very crucial thing is many neighborhoods have fetes. You have community events. Invite reclaimers to participate in those. Also, it's winter. It's really cold. Put out some, there's some neighborhoods where residents will set up coffee and tea for the reclaimers to show their appreciation and to have some snacks. In addition, if you live particularly in Johannesburg, there is a remarkable organization called the African Reclaimers Organization. Look for them on Facebook and social media. And ARROW is a mass-based democratic movement of reclaimers. They do remarkable things for their members. For example, they created a creche in an informal settlement in Newtown called Begazela. And some of the nursery schools in the areas that are serviced by ARROW have partnered with the creche, and they do training and support for the teachers. You can give toys, you can do all sorts of things. If you are, you are all professionals, you have skills. You can volunteer. We have a solidarity committee, an ARROW solidarity committee made up of residents who lend our skills. There's artists who help them to design things. There's filmmakers who make little films about them or with them. And so take your skills that you have and volunteer to support these organizations.
Thank you, Professor. Another question from Shannon. What are the big sellers the reclaimers are generally able to sell? Would it only be normal plastic and glass items?
Mm-hmm. So, the PET, those are, the plastic Coke bottles, people collect PET. People collect any kind of hard plastic and cardboard and white paper, clean paper. Glass is a little bit difficult because glass is very heavy and worth very little. And so many reclaimers do not collect glass. But it's also, you are from across Gauteng, right? So what happens is in Johannesburg, you can sell a far wider range of materials than you can in smaller towns, right? Or areas that are further from industry. And so really, you have to ask your local reclaimer what it is that they are looking for.
Thank you for that. Another question that's come through: sustainability and minimizing waste is a huge importance to me. This is Kelsey Vessels. I thrift and upcycle most of my clothes. I recycle my plastics and I refurbish old furniture. How do I get my colleagues, or more so my workplace, to have the same mindset as I have? I think they see secondhand things as trash. How can we combat this?
Well, I would love to hear the ideas from other people. But I do think hosting these kinds of conversations is really important. I think if you go to the website, you'll find we have the cartoons for children, but we also have some really good educational videos for adults. So if your workplace maybe has educational events like this one, maybe you can say, let's screen one of these movies, let's have a discussion. You can always invite reclaimers, to come and speak. You can invite me. I'm a little bit busy, but sometimes I can make time. But I really think for me, what I have found most effective is focusing on the human element. And again, if you go to the website, you'll see we worked with a wonderful photographer named Mark Lewis and have these beautiful photo stories about the day in the life of a reclaimer, about how reclaimers live. There's actually one photo story about how reclaimers themselves upcycle, and the how they reuse materials in their own homes. And I think that that can be useful. You're actually making me realize we've done some great radio interviews, and I'll see if there's a way to link those radio interviews to the website, because again, that's something that people can be listening to.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yeah, I mean, we do have, for this month, we have a group. So if you're on that group, if the professor is able to share any information, any additional information with us, we'll be sure to send it out on the group, so everyone can just look out on that group. I think, Professor, I think we're going to, unless there are any other questions, I think we're going to close out the session. I really just want to say thank you so much to you for making the time, for the amazing work that you and that you do in the space of reclaiming. And I think in terms of giving dignity to reclaimers, because I think that that's really important. That's what this conversation has really been about, how we can do our part by separating the trash that we may have, washing out the containers before we put it into the dustbin, so that we really are doing our part to provide dignity to people that are doing invaluable work in our communities. I think we can also have a little bit of patience on the roads when we see these reclaimers pulling these really heavy trolleys. If we cannot think of it as a nuisance on the road, but rather recognize that they're doing some really hard labor that really helps our society as a whole. So I just want to say thank you very much to you for your time. And then on behalf of the GWII Charter Risk Underwriting Managers, I'd really like to thank everyone for joining our call this morning. If you're, as I mentioned before, if you're not on the WhatsApp group, please hop onto that. Remember that tomorrow is World Environment Day and the 8th of June is World Oceans Day. It's really in a month that we can spend some time just to consider our environment, the small changes that each one of us can make in our own homes, in our own lives, in the companies that we work at, that can really have a lasting impact on the health of our earth. We have so much more in store for you this month, and I'm really excited to engage with you. So, Professor, once again, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing everyone at the next event. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.